Good afternoon, everyone. Some of you not know that the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister has a MOA with the Institute for Competitiveness, just as it does with NCER. And one of the reports the Institute for Competitiveness has done for us is on the state of inequality in India. So let me invite Dr. Amit Kapoor to make the presentation on the report.
Thank you, Dr. Degoy. It's absolutely a privilege for us to have worked on this report. I'm really trying to get insights on the idea of inequality. But in terms of insights in the presentation, I'll request Jessica, who's my young colleague who's worked with me on the report as well, to really share the ideas. Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. The State of Inequality in India report seeks to bring out information of two kinds. First, the kinds of inequalities that exist in India, and second, how these inequalities are multidimensional in nature. When we're talking about multidimensional, we emphasize on the fact that how these variables combine themselves to form an ecosystem of inequality that leads to leads to the understanding that the lack of something leads to the lack of other things as well. When we're talking about inequality, there are some related concepts that also come up, them notably being inequity, equity, and equality. When we talk about inequality and inequity, we understand inequality is still a very relative term. It is lack of something in respect to the other. Inequities, on the other hand, is an absolute term. It can be measured, it can be quantified. So when we look at the solution to inequality, it's not simply equality. It's rather equity, equitable distribution of resources, of opportunities, and of services. And that households that require extra support to reach that level playing field get that support. The report focuses on an in-depth coverage of variables like income profiles, labor market dynamics, health, education, and household characteristics. We now move to a correlation between inequality and poverty to understand what kind of a relationship these two variables share. And we find that they are both mutually reinforcing variables that spill over in the form of socio-economic inequities. Now, let's say lack of incomes or low incomes can undoubtedly lead to a higher chance of descent into multidimensional poverty. International organizations like World Bank and IMF have also worked a lot on this field, on understanding inequality and poverty and trying to figure out methodologies of measuring them. And recently, both World Bank and IMF have come up with working papers that focus on the state of inequality and poverty in India and how new methodologies can be derived in the same way. As we talked, at a point on solution of inequality and households getting that extra support to reach that level playing field, we imply by that a system of social protection, of social safety nets. And by that, we mean mechanisms that can correct socioeconomic inequities, that can provide a cushion to households, to marginalized households in the face of very radical socioeconomic changes. Now, these social protection systems can be in the form of benefit transfers in cash or in kind. We already know India has a very robust social protection system, and we see that the expenditure on social services has also increased over the years from around 6.2% in 2014 and 15, to 26.6% in 2021 to 22, which is a very remarkable thing to do. At the same time, when we looked at sectoral wise, we see that in health, there has been a considerable increase in the budget, while there's a marginal decline in education, in the expenditure on education. This slide gives a detailed information on various social protection schemes that are currently operating in the country in tandem with various state governments. And they're from different, they're operating in different fields from employment and education and skill development to nutrition and health. We now move to the first chapter, which is India's income profile and labor market dynamics. Now, through this report, one of the things we want to propose is that in between wealth concentration and income distribution is a far more dynamic variable to understand to understand inequality, and that is so because it gives us an insight as to what are the changes in terms of purchasing capacity of households. Now, wealth concentration being a stock variable does not give us that kind of an insight. The graph shows that in India, the pyramid of income, to say so, is a bit skewed, where the top 10% earns more than the bottom 50% and the bottom 10%. When we look at actual numbers given through PLFS 2019 and 20, if we take it up, and we see that it's over a billion, 6 billion rupees in India, the share of top 10%, it's equivalent to approximately bottom 64% in the country. At the same time, in terms of actual incomes earned, we see that rupees 25,000 a month or 3 lakh rupees per annum is already in the top 10% of the incomes earned in the country. So it's of course something that we need to give attention to. Coming to labor market dynamics, it definitely gives us a very positive picture. When we look that the labor force participation rate has increased from 2017 and 18 to currently at around 53.5% in 2019 and 20. Looking at the gender-based analysis, we definitely see that the female labor force participation rate is quite behind the male labor force participation rate, and that gap needs to be reduced. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that something very positive has happened, which is a dramatic rise from approximately 23.3% in 2017 and 18 to 30% in 2019 and 20. So, of course, something structurally influential is happening here that needs to be given credit and needs to be pushed so that more women laborers enter the labor force. We now move to the section on socio-economic manifestations, which we start from health. And here it is quite visible that India has done remarkably well in terms of increase in infrastructure of sub-centers and primary health centers and community health centers, which also means that there's a deeper penetration of health services in rural India specifically. At the same time, when we compare data from NFHS 5 and NFHS 4, we see all the negative variables like infant mortality rate or near mortality rate. All of these things have registered a decline. The area of concern arises when we look at the affordability of these services, and we find that the out-of-pocket expenditure in the country on health services continues to be large. Now, health is one of those areas in a household's life experience that causes deep shock. So there's always a chance that people fall back to their savings to furnish the bills, or they rely on informal sources of credit, which of course needs to be looked at because these kind of factors increases their vulnerability. We see when we look at expenditure on delivery, we see that in rural sector, there's approximately 2,700 rupees being spent, and in urban sectors, rupees 3,500. So this variation is also becomes the point of work that needs to be looked at. In terms of expenditure on specific treatments, let's say cancer, which happens to be an expensive treatment, we see that government hospitals offer the treatment at, let's say, about 61 to 62,000 rupees, while in private hospitals, the same treatment is at rupees 93,000, which is approximately 1.5 times more. So these kind of variations needs to be looked at, so that these services become more affordable. And secondly, this also gives us an opportunity to look at the total health coverage in terms of insurances and finances in the country as well. Looking at the nutritional profile, we see that in terms of under 5 population, children, of under 5 years, the percentage in stunting and wasting has gone down, which is obviously a positive sign. Currently, we have approximately 32.1% of children that are underweight, 3.4% overweight, and 7.7% severely wasted, with states like Jharkhand, Bihar, Maharashtra coming up as states which have a higher population of nutritionally deprived children. We now come to education. Now, education, of course, is not something that will give us an immediate solution to inequality, but what education or investment in education does, that it targets structural changes in the nature of inequality that exist in any country. So when a student enters or begins their education journey, let's say at about 4 or 5 years, which is their foundational years, and the journey is about, let's say, 20-22 years, that's 20 years of time where we can really tap into their human capacity, where we can really enhance their potential, that once they come out of their education cycle, they are met with jobs and they're gainfully employed. And that not only drives economy and growth, but also helps these students to drive their families out of the poverty cycle. At the same time, when we're talking about education, we all know it's not simply handing over a pen or a book to a child. It's also creating an infrastructure that aids their cognitive development. This infrastructure does not only rest at more library rooms, more reading rooms, more classrooms, and computer facilities, all of which I must say India has done remarkably well in. It also starts from basic things that are more number of washrooms, having access to safe drinking water or having water in urinals and washrooms, so that students have proper hygiene in school, and that schools do not become a place where students catch infections from. And we see that we have now 95% of schools that have proper washrooms. We have 97.5% of schools which establish safe drinking water facilities. And we have approximately 83.11% of 78% of Anganwadi centers that have tap water supply for their urinals and washrooms. Now, these kind of infrastructural developments obviously translate into higher gross enrollment ratios, higher net enrollment ratios, and lower dropout rates. Now, when we talk about dropout rates, we need to look that there's, of course, a considerable decline over the years, as the data shows. But the number or the percentage is still higher in the secondary and the higher secondary level. So the target should also be that a student not only enrolls and studies till primary section, but continues and completes their education till at least higher secondary. Now we come to the final chapter of the report, which is on household characteristics. Now we've taken up this chapter, this variable, to say, so to understand what are the everyday experiences of inequality and poverty on a household, and how does that impact their experiences of vulnerability, of exclusion, and of dignity. We look at factors like electrification, access to clean drinking water, sanitation, and availability of safe cooking fuel. And we see that we now, when we look at the data from NFHS 5, we see that 95.9% households have now access to safe drinking water sources, while 100% coverage in states like Goa, Telangana, and Haryana for functional house tap connections. Additionally, when we go and focus on sanitation, we see 70.2% of households now have proper improved sanitation facilities, while we have achieved 100% coverage in individual household latrines. That means washrooms or latrines in the premises of those households, so that people don't have to go far away or to open fields to defecate. At the same time, states like Andhra Pradesh, Mizoram, Telangana have done remarkably well, as they have highest percentage of households that have access to clean cooking fuel. On the basis of all these findings over these variables, we have made certain insights that target more job creation, that look at the issue of informalization of labor, of gender-based labor market differences, as well as more expenditure on health and education particularly. And on the basis of those, we've made certain recommendations. Now, these recommendations begin with one, establishing airtight slabs for the middle class. Now, India obviously has a higher middle class, or have a major population that comes in the middle class, but we don't have proper definitions as to how do we understand this composition. So to look at the movement from, let's say, a lower middle class to middle class and upper middle class, that helps us in establishing their share in the income profiles as well. So one of the recommendations is to make clear distinctions, and that also helps in establishing beneficiaries of social protection programs. We then look at raising minimum incomes and establishing universal basic income. To look at employment guarantee schemes like Manrega that we have in rural sector, to have those similar schemes in urban sectors, so that the surplus labor is rehabilitated, more expenditure on, or more spending on health and education, and additionally that measurement exercises and assessments like foundational learning and numeracy index or social progress and ease of living index. These kind of exercises are encouraged so that we have continuous stock taking exercises happening so that we can measure what is the overall well-being of the population in the country. And we hope that with this report, we are able to establish a roadmap for inequality and poverty reduction in the country, that it becomes that this body of work becomes influential in aiding policy work and coming up with targeted strategies and policies. And at the same time that the discourse is now opened up to the public as well, and that public takes part in the debates and solutions to inequality reduction in the country. Um, Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jessica. So just saying, I think one of the most important factors that I presume or believe is that we need to really see how do we define poverty. I think wealth or income is just not the only parameter that we have to really look at. We need to dig deeper and go deeper in terms of really understanding how to look at it. And we have just tried to look at the spectrum, and we do see that there is a huge improvement that the country has actually seen in the last few years, especially the last 5 years. And we see an improvement across different sets of things, like say, toilets to education to outcomes and so on and so forth. But without further ado, but thanks a lot, Dr. De Broglie, for giving us the opportunity. But without further ado, can we request to release the report, please?
Stand up or
Yes, if you can. And could we request you to take a picture, please, possible?
remember each other. Used to unwrapping all the time.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Dr. De Broglie, for the release of the report. But could I now request you to give brief remarks on the report? Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Kapoor, and thank you, Institute for Competitiveness, for having done this report for us. And thank you, Jessica, for that very comprehensive presentation, which is almost sounded like a unified field theory for development economics in India. 20 years ago, some 20 years ago, there was a book in honor of Dr. Manmohan Singh, edited by Montek Singh Ahluwalia. And Suresh Tendulkar wrote a paper in that, and Suresh Tendulkar, as most people know, is closely identified with notions and element of poverty and inequality. So in that, Suresh Tendulkar recounted an anecdote which goes back to the mid-80s when Dr. Manmohan Singh was the deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, and he had gone to China, and the then Chinese deputy minister was making a presentation on China's reforms. Whereupon Suresh Tendulkar, who was probably present, says, Dr. Manmohan Singh was greatly alarmed and remarked to the Chinese minister, but isn't all this going to increase inequality? To which the Chinese minister responded, we certainly hope so. There is a lot of work on inequality, including Kushnetz, Oshima, etc., theoretical as well as empirical, suggesting that when a country goes through rapid growth, inequality actually increases. So I would be very worried about the recommendation that you made at the end that we should try to reduce inequality. It all boils down to data. What data are we using? How are we measuring poverty? How are we measuring inequality? The fact of the matter is that in India, we have never had data, comprehensive data, and we will never have data on measuring income inequality. The closest was NCER many years ago, but one is very skeptical of that despite it being NCER. What we do have, or what we should have, is data on the distribution of consumption expenditure. Unfortunately, it is the case that the last comprehensive NSS data on consumption expenditure is for 2011-12, and we have had nothing after that. In all probability, another consumption expenditure round will start this year, but we will not have the process data till the end of next year. In the absence of this data on consumption expenditure, in the absence of a clear articulation of what is the poverty line, obviously we do not know what the poverty numbers are, and everyone jumps into the bandwagon. All kinds of people do some kind of extrapolation on the basis of whatever is 2011-12, on the basis of some assumed Tendulkar poverty line, and come up with all kinds of estimates. The multidimensional poverty index is actually an implant. It's an imported implant. The notion is absolutely fine. It's also not a new notion. After all, that's the reason the UNDP started the HDI. At the moment, since we don't have data, the only satisfactory data we can use is the PLFS, with all of its warts and blemishes, which is what this report mostly uses. I'm extremely skeptical, which Jessica also made the point in the presentation, about anything that has to do with the distribution of wealth. Because as she said, wealth is really a stock. We should be focused on the flow, which is income, consumption, expenditure, whatever it may happen to be. On the basis of past trends of 2011-12, I would not be very surprised if we are talking about the personal distribution of consumption expenditure and income, because inequality has many dimensions. There's inequality in the distribution of assets, inequality in the distribution of land, all kinds of things. If we are talking about inequality that is in the personal distribution, because of past trends, I won't be very surprised if there has been an increase measured in terms of the Gini coefficient on the urban side. The question really to ask, which is not there in the report, I'm just flagging it, the question really to ask is what kind of Gini coefficient? And Poonam knows this stuff far better than I do. Offhand, I think that the Gini coefficient would probably be today, urban would probably be 0.35 or something like that, and consumption expenditure, rural would be a little bit lower. And it's perfectly understandable that that measure should increase. And the reason for that is obvious. Think of it in the following sense, that if I've got 600,000 villages and I'm trying to integrate them, and I'm picking the larger villages, automatically the larger villages tend to become integrated, whereas the smaller villages, population sizes less than 500, remain still marginalized. So the distance by whatever metric between those, the larger villages increases. I think the great utility of this report is on a different kind of inequality, which is not the personal distribution, but it is the spatial distribution. We know that there are differences between states. We know that the government, union government as well as state governments, have been trying to ensure basic necessities. And this is what it documents. Despite improvements, there are still significant variations among states. States are national administrative boundaries, although there are differences within states. And NFHS also documents that. The question, of course, to ask is to look at the deltas, the increments, because the base has variations defined as equity, defined as inclusion, ensuring everyone in this country, every citizen in this country, regardless of where he or she happens to reside, should have access to a certain minimum threshold level of goods and services. With that proposition, we know that variations exist. The question is not the absolute levels, the question is really the deltas. Have those deltas come down over time or not? To do that, one obviously needs a longer time series. So I would say this is very useful. It's particularly useful because there is a complete lack of data, so everyone is shooting in the dark. This is also shooting not in the dark, it's shooting in the twilight, but all right, it's not completely dark. So thank you once again for doing this report for us.
Thank you, Dr. Lebroy. Heartening to hear that at least this is not shooting in the dark. This is positive movement in terms of what we have been able to achieve. But with your permission, we'll just directly jump into the panel discussion. So we have three esteemed guests here for the panel discussion. We have Dr. Poonam Gupta, Dr. Suresh Babu, and Dr. Charan Singh. Thanks a lot, all of you, for really joining us. But Poonamji, I'll go with you. So my first point, like as you were already looking at this work and you're listening to Jessica as well, what in your opinion presents a much more better understanding of depth and nature of inequality, like income distribution or wealth concentration? Is this report a step in the right direction? And what more needs to be done?
Right. So thank you very much for having me over. I really enjoyed reading the report. What I also did was I brushed up some of the literature. It's not an issue on which I generally work, so I had to come up to speed. And I really benefited from both reading your report as well as a little bit of the literature out there. And I touched upon the literature on India as well as international. And I think my comments in a way are going to complement what Dr. Lebroy said. So given that I come from a growth with stability perspective, I usually overlook the distribution. For me, it's important to shift the distribution to the right, even if the dispersion remains the same. And if it shrinks a little bit, all the more better. But it's not about just shrinking it so much that your sources of growth get impacted in the process. So this is where I come from. So as Dr. Lebroy said, there are multiple ways to think about inequality. You have talked about income and wealth, and there's a very important component, which is consumption. So this is just on the measurement side, but then there can be other metrics to look at inequality, which can be regional, which can be gender, which can be across skills, across age groups. And all of these matter. And while there are measurement issues and data issues around measuring income, wealth, or consumption inequality, some of the measures are more easily established. So gender, for example, there is clear gender inequality, as you mentioned. When women don't participate in the labor force, they are not earning. When they enter the labor force, and it's coming from the vast literature, more of the international side than India, they earn less for the same amount of work. The progression is limited. Many women leave the workforce, or they are not taken up into leadership positions. So gender is a very, very important aspect. COVID also showed us other vulnerabilities. So who did COVID impact the most? Younger, less skilled, and women. So these are, in a way, vulnerable populations. And I think when we are talking about equality, but also about the role of public policy, the kind of policies you had in mind, if I'm in the policymaker's seat, I will be a little bit cautious about those. But when it's about skills and gender and age, I think those are easily to relate to and easy enough, but easier to address. So this is how I would look at. So in my mind, but if I just look at income and consumption versus wealth, I think it's about the short term and the long term. So in the short term, what matters from the policymaker's perspective is consumption equality more than the income. And if there is a role for public policy, then it relates more directly to consumption than to income. Income is about equal access to everybody to participate in the income generation process. And wealth is something that in my mind, only impacts intergenerational mobility, not within the generation. And this is something as a policymaker I would not worry about, except to use it as a tool to improve living standards for those at the bottom of the pyramid. So to come back to your question, I think I relate more to consumption or income distribution, but the role of public policy would be to support those at the bottom, but also enable them to participate in the income generation process, then giving out handouts year after year or decade after decade. Wealth is just a tool to get to that through some taxation or other equalizing measures.
Thank you, Poonam. In fact, I'll come back to you, but Sureshi, I would like to get you into the conversation. When we talk about multidimensional poverty or inequality, we are looking at a comprehensive assessment of the situation. But if you are to then propose a specific solution, what is the solution that you would have, or what would be the starting point in your opinion? What kind of targeted policy? Poonam has alluded to some few things, but probably.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. Well, as Poonam was suggesting, I also went through the report prior, and thanks to a lot of data and very, very comprehensive in terms of data. But let me come back to this question in a slightly different way. See, the whole approach towards measuring inequality from a multidimensional perspective is a recent one. It's basically the last 10 years that we have been seeing studies of that. The approach towards measuring poverty in a multidimensional way started a little early, but measuring multidimensional inequality is a very recent one. And it has got a number of advantages, and that takes me straight to this question on policy. Now, what are these advantages that I am talking about? See, as Deaton pointed out, when you look at from a multidimensional perspective, we know that, well, there is a kind of an interrelation between the variables that are affecting inequality. So what it actually enables us is to provide a kind of a bundle of policies which could actually tackle in one shot the number of indicators that you are actually taking to really capture this multiple dimensions. Yeah. So what do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that when we look at this multidimensional measures, we can actually identify what we call as consistently poor groups. When we say consistently poor, what I mean is that they're really backward, or they're really deprived in terms of not only one indicator, but in a series of indicators. And these indicators interact. So that helps us in terms of really tackling or identifying the target groups. Okay. Now, in terms of policies towards tackling this inequality and multidimensional aspect of that, I would say there are three important aspects which we need to keep in mind. One, of course, promoting opportunities, and that has been the bulk of public policy discussions in India as well. That is, effective private investments to unlock productive capacities in people, providing opportunities to enter into the labor market. Yeah, when you listed out those set of policy measures at the state level as well as at the central level, bulk of these are directed towards that. The second set of policies are basically facilitating empowerment. And that is very important because, when we think of the second aspect which Poonam was talking about, intergenerational equality, then this empowerment aspect becomes very important. And that is what we see when we look at, again, the policies that you outlined, especially in terms of laying the political and legal basis for an inclusive development model. Third set of policies, of course, which is very important, especially when we are talking about female labor force participation, is basically enhancing security. Enhancing security is very important in terms of not only helping certain sections, but also helping the poor in general. Finally, I would say that there is a dire need to link poverty, inequalities, and social cohesion, because empirical evidence from across the globe now really shows that, well, if there is no concerted effort to have social cohesion, it is basically this deprived as well as unequal societies that experience political instability. So, to sum up, I would say that policies would have four aspects. Of course, providing opportunities, facilitating empowerment, enhancing security, and linking poverty, inequality, and social cohesion.
Thank you, Suresh. Dr. Singh, in fact, I would just like to pick up the question from what Suresh was saying. So he makes a very important point, and that is that there is an urgent, there is this huge thing of social cohesion and how deprived societies can actually have income instability. But this is where my question is: do you think, in light of this statement, do we need to redefine poverty and inequality, or it's just the right thing right now, or we just continue with the thinking, or we just really move ahead?
Yeah, I think that's a very relevant question. If you look at the poverty indices, and as Professor Deborah was mentioning it, he's very right. It has sort of evolved over time, and it is very relative. I'll share an anecdote with you during this discussion. So initially it was consumption-based, so calories. Then it was income-based. And then now we are discussing and saying that the calorie was not able to capture poverty in its totality, nor was the income criteria able to capture in totality. And then, of course, you made that distinction between income and wealth. And therein also there is this rich literature which says that, well, wealth is consumption or not consumption. Wealth only impacts intergenerational, or can it impact directly? And therefore, these are issues which need to be debated and discussed. And therefore, there is no one answer for that. And I think the concept of poverty is evolving over time. Now, let me share an anecdote here with you, which will sort of demonstrate the evolution of this concept. In 1993, I was interacting with Nanak Kakwani, and Nanak Kakwani, as you know, is an authority on poverty, and he was our professor. And one of those fine days, he met us and told us that he's been drafted by the World Bank to go and estimate poverty in New York. So we were very surprised. I come from India, studying in Sydney, and Nanak Kakwani is going to study poverty in New York. So we were really questioning him as to how is he going to measure poverty in New York. Well, it all boils down to the fact that poverty is a very relative concept. And not only that he was measuring poverty in New York, it also happened that later on, when you look at the poverty line in America, or you look at the poverty line in Sydney or Australia, the things that they include in the basket of poverty line are so large that a privileged Indian would be happy to have that poverty line. So therefore, I think this is evolving. Now, as you know, the World Bank has said there are two poverty lines. One is $1.9 and the other is 3.2. I'm sure they're going to redefine it, and there is a need to redefine it. And I don't think 1.9 is the right indicator for poverty line. It has to certainly move upwards. So that is bound to happen. But whenever I sit next to Professor Deborah, and I was very scared when you said he is launching the book, I did look into the ancient literature. And I said, look, what does the Indian ancient literature tell us about poverty, and more importantly, about income inequalities? And as you know, that these are areas which are very rich, and ancient literature is also very rich in all these areas. And my discussions then led me to believe that income equality, the way we have been looking at, and you're right, there's a multidimensional aspects which you have rightly highlighted in the book. You've taken education, you've taken health, you've taken from the consumer angle different assets. You're very right. But then my feeling is, in India, should we just adopt the concept as has evolved through the recent literature, or should we fall back and look into Indian ancient literature and see what's happening there? Let me concede right at the beginning, estimating poverty itself is a challenge. Estimating inequality is a much bigger challenge. But in the Indian ancient literature that I see, And I want to just give you as a hint two stories. Krishna is the king, but his best friend is Sudama. And Sudama continues to be very poor for a very long time, but he's his best friend, childhood friend. Until, of course, we know the story as he comes and meets and things change. Same is the story with Lord Rama, where he goes and meets the Bhilini and she is giving him little bear to eat. And Lord Rama is the king. So I go back to what Professor Du Bois said, and I totally agree with that. As economic development takes place, there's bound to be some income inequalities, and they come along with development per se. Look at the literature which IMF is showing us, and therein also it's emerging so clearly that income inequalities do arise, but it should not hamper growth, as Professor Puram was mentioning. If it hampers growth, then something alarming and intervention has to begin. So what is that came through the ancient literature that I'm trying to talk to? I think the value system. So the value system does not get captured in all the computations that we attempt, as it is very difficult to attempt. But if you look at the value systems that were prevalent there, and now why do I bring in the story of the value system? At the end of the day, what are we trying to look at? Poverty or income inequality? Are we trying to say we want to look at the population, is it happy or unhappy? Or is it welfare oriented or not welfare oriented? And that is wherein I think rather than just the materialistic concepts that we follow, in a country like India, at least I would like to make an attempt, just focused on the materialistic things that we follow, or should we also start looking at value-based things? Or should we start capturing in some way or the other happiness? I'd just like to conclude by making one simple observation. As a young man, when I went abroad, I was very stunned to see and read about the antidepressant sales and the high market that these advanced countries were. And I kept wondering that in my own study of economic literature, growth story, I never knew that there is a downside risk like this. So therefore, I have started thinking in our contribution to the global literature, if we can distill some lessons and incorporate, at least start a debate that this is something missing in the Western literature. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Singh. Dr. Du Bois, I'm sure you have to say some points, so you have some other guests here as well.
Thank you, Amit. Just three quick things. I think the timing of this report is something that we should remember. Not the timing of the report, but the timing of the data used in the report. The terminal year for the PLFS is 2019-20, which is part of the COVID pandemic. Given that, I am pleasantly surprised that what you're describing is not worse than what one would have expected. And in all probability, this is because of the government's attempts to provide economic survey, quoting economic survey, basic necessities. I think the more interesting question to ask, not in this report, I'm talking about in general, is what do you expect something like the pandemic to do? It's an exogenous shock. To get anything meaningful, one would probably have to separate out rural from urban, but let's ignore that. If there's an well, before that, what do you expect growth to do to poverty? Growth will lead to a reduction in poverty, but the people who will rise above the poverty line, however defined, will be people who are just below the poverty line. Those are the ones who will go up. So when there is a shock, these are the people who will drop below the poverty line. The point being that when growth recovers, these people will rise above the poverty line again. So just for argument's sake, even if we had an increase in poverty, which we don't have data to establish because of the pandemic, if the growth recovers, we need not be worried. Offhand, and I'm just shooting my mouth off, I'm inclined to think that the Tendulkar poverty line would give us a poverty ratio of something like 20% or thereabouts today. I have no idea, I'm just guessing. But this has a bearing on something Poonam said. But she didn't use this expression, but she suggested it in a way. That whether it's an income distribution or whether it's a consumption distribution, typically there'll be log normal. So there'll be thick here. And here is the poverty line. So whenever the thick part of the distribution moves above the poverty line, you'll have a sudden drop in poverty. So if the growth resumes at 7%, 7.5%, and we let it, and we assume it continues for 5 years, 10 years, we should not be very surprised with that constant poverty line, that the poverty ratio in India drops to something like 10%. It's below that, it will be exceedingly difficult. The second point I want to make is about inequality. I suspect that all aggregate measures of inequality will not tell me much. Whether it's Gini, share of top 10%, share of bottom 20%, because I think what has happened more on the urban side, less on the rural side, but in both cases, is the underlying shape of the Lawrence curve has changed. And what is probably happening is that the bit in the middle is getting squeezed. So whenever the consumption survey happens, I'd be very interested to see not what has happened to the Gini, but also what has happened to the actual shape of the Lawrence curve.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. DeBroy. But just following up on his point, one very important point Dr. Singh alluded to, and that was about $1.9 as the poverty line. So the next question that comes to the mind is, how should we really define it? What should be the very criteria? Should we really look at when you're middle class, or as Dr. DeBroy says, it should just be consumption? Then how do we really measure at what level of consumption and things?
So I like the analysis which Professor DeBroy has just made, and I think it is very thoughtful of him that he has made that. It's just not the extremes that really matter. It is when he speaks of the Lawrence curve and the shape of it, that is extremely important. And therefore, I understand from his argument that if there is deep concentration at the upper end, it doesn't mean that the lowest end has suddenly been deprived. And that's why I agree with his analysis that just depending on aggregates does not give you the correct picture, as it is a very difficult exercise that is being attempted. So I think the middle part and what's the shape of the Lawrence curve that is moved, that is very important that one has to see. Professor DeBroy has made another very good point, and I think I should have mentioned it, but it is there in the book and I liked it. The two papers that have been mentioned, one from the World Bank and one from the IMF, I think are extremely important. They drive home a very relevant point. And that is the government interventions have hardly ever been captured. But the paper which has been mentioned in the book, and rightly so, captures that government intervention and says that, look, to a great extent, we have probably stopped the fall from that line to below that. I think that's a very crucial thing that has been mentioned during the COVID time, and that needs to be captured. On that very argument, I also wanted to make another point, and I hope I get a chance to interact with the authors. While the food security has been accounted for, and that is what has been captured in that study, there is one more thing which has not been captured and no study has captured. And I think that's a gap in our literature which we need to, some scholars will have to work on it. Maybe at EGRU we'll try to take it up. And that is the government's attempt at providing health and health care during that difficult time. In your own study, you repeatedly mentioned that two things which push people below the poverty line. One is the expenditure on health, which suddenly hits you, and the shock, and that's why Professor DeBroy probably is referring to the shock and the date of the survey, 2019-20. the expenditure part on health has been taken care by the government through either free vaccinations or free access to the hospitals and free hospitalization during that time. Your own analysis showed that the private sector, and which is where most of the people land up because public hospitals may not be available to that extent, is much expensive than the government hospitals. So therefore, if that is also captured in, I think India needs to acknowledge that and undertake a study which shows that to a great extent we were able to contain the fall of people below the poverty line, and also I feel the shape of the Lawrence curve. So I think these two aspects probably in days to come should be studied, and government intervention needs to be congratulated during difficult fiscal times. This support was provided.
Thank you. Poonamji, I would just like to come to you here. Like we have been talking about a lot of change that has happened, but one big issue we really talk about inequality of things is female labor force participation rate. And there's been always a huge negative around this. But what we find through numbers is that the labor force participation rate for women has actually risen. How do you really look at this situation, or how do we really start thinking of if more needs to be done? Should we think of affirmative action for women in some way, or how do we deal with this?
Right. So as you have mentioned in the report, and many others have talked about it as well, that while India has achieved a lot in many spheres, it remains an outlier when it comes to women participating in the labor force. And it is an enigma. And the usual factors do not explain it. Level of income, democracy, progression on so many indicators on education, digital, etc. So, and there could be a number of reasons for it. One is a very sharply backward bending supply curve with respect to family income. So the moment family income reaches above a certain threshold, it's not considered worthwhile for women to be in formal labor force. It's about our culture. It's also about the working conditions for women, safety. And I think two significant parts of it are also mobility of women. How do they get to the workforce? Do they rely on public transport? And what happens to childcare? So there are a number of factors which make this ratio low for India. And then the question is it an ideal situation? And what would be the implications? In my mind, the implications are that when half of your population is not able to contribute to growth, there will be some natural limits to how well we are growing and how productively we are growing. So the talent of a full 50% of our population is not being leveraged. What are the ways out? I think it will have to be a combination of factors. It will have to include things that I mentioned. And in fact, I was thinking about it just the other day, such as we have a slogan, Atmanirbhar Bharat. We should have Atmanirbhar Mahilai. It can be a campaign. It need to mainstream it. We are not realizing the impact it will have, or it already is having on our potential growth. Maybe we can grow in 8, 9, 10%, even if we can leverage the talent pool that is sitting there. Not able to contribute to formal activities. It will have to be around safety. It will have to be, if there's a role for public policy, maybe tax incentives for working women, and also incentives so that women become more mobile. And here my observations are coming from 2 years that I spent in Vietnam. Nearly 70-75% female participation ratio in labor force. And two things struck out anecdotally. Everybody's mobile with a two-wheeler. You're not dependent on public transport or a male family member to take you from point A to point B. The other was the school hours. So there was a prevalence of public schooling. Schools would run for 9 hours, which allowed the parent to drop the child to school and still go back and work for 8 hours and come back and pick up the child. So if half an hour is spent in commuting in each direction, you're not worried about childcare. Your child is in school for 9 hours. So these are not the usual kind of policy interventions we think about, but I think it's very important for us to take this issue seriously. Two more points. You asked about affirmative action. Affirmative action will work if we think the distortion is that women are not, that there is a bias, gender bias towards entry of women into labor force. And I don't think that's the reason at all. So there is an entire life cycle over the working life of an individual, which is skewed against working for women. Fewer enter, more leave. When they are in the workforce, they don't get paid, progression is limited, and they're missing at leadership roles. So if affirmative action can play a role, perhaps it's at the leadership level. That is where women who have stayed behind in labor force for enough number of years, maybe there is a bias then for them to make into leadership. But at entry level, I don't see a role for that. But there can be a role for many other things, as I said. Fiscal can be one, changing the mindset can be the other one. Thank you.
Thank you, Poonamji. Suresh, yeah, just getting into the conversation, we have talked about many interesting aspects here. And we did talk about affirmative action in a certain way. But, like what we have seen during the pandemic, as well, that the support that the government provided, especially during for healthcare. So do you think it gives us some insight in terms of what kind of social protection schemes we should have? And how deep those protection schemes should be? How do you really want to look at this?
Yeah, I think it is extremely important to continue with the social protection schemes, and perhaps that is one of the things that the pandemic has really taught us. Well, there are 5 pillars on which a good social protection scheme has to be built. One, of course, interventions in the labor market. 2, a series of social insurance schemes, which is already, a lot of it is already in place. 3, social assistance. 4, we also need to have micro area-based insurance schemes. And 5th, which I would really highlight, is to have child development schemes. Now, in the aftermath of the pandemic, I will really focus on 2 important schemes which we need to really emphasize. One is basically micro area based schemes, because what we are now seeing is a kind of vulnerabilities that are located in certain regions, be it the rural or be it in certain geographical pockets. Now we need to have some kind of a mechanism to address that. And when we are designing a national social protection policy, this has to be in the forefront now. There are some initiatives, for example, the crop insurance scheme, and certain crops and certain sectors are covered and things of that sort. But I think we need to have a little more deeper kind of a penetration of such schemes. Second, in the post-COVID phase, we need to have child protection schemes. When we look at some of the numbers on which really school education has been really impacted, we need to really focus on the early childhood as well as to really mitigate the post-COVID effects on school education system. I think the imperative now is on these 2 in terms of child protection as well as area and crop based kind of protection. And when I emphasize on area and crop based, that is for one single reason. There is a kind of a challenge which the agriculture sector is now facing, that is to mitigate climate change. Now, seasons are changing, crops duration are changing, lifespans of crops are changing. So to really mitigate these effects, we need to have some kind of an insurance for them. So I would argue for these 2 as 2 major schemes that we should have in terms of reducing poverty and inequality. And this is tied up to what Dr. Deborah was talking about, this whole vulnerable sections of the population, because it is these sections of the population who, with the support of some schemes like this, who move up the poverty line. And once when a shock comes, they really fall. That's the transit group which we are talking about. Yeah. So this would be my take on this.
Thank you, Suresh. But coming to the last question, and I know we are just coming towards the end of the conversation, but one question to you, Dr. Singh, how should we really move ahead? What should be the way forward for a country like us? What should be the ways? What should be the policy action? What action should we take? And I think this is the same question for all of you here.
My own understanding is, given whatever the crudeness of the indicator that it is and that has been discussed and that emerges so apparently in our discussion today, I think we need to continue. Of course, we need to, as I said earlier also, that the concept will evolve and we need to keep evolving it. But it has to move into the multidimensional aspect, which you have in your conclusions and insights. I think that's the right direction to move in. There are other concepts which have been there, like what should be, as I mentioned earlier, relativity of the poverty line. As you know, the middle income is also a very relative term, varies in emerging countries from $2 to $13, which is a World Bank indicator, and this $13 is the 2005 purchasing power. So the middle income, and you have in your report too mentioned it, and I think we need to develop that concept. And then if we are able to get or fine tune the poverty concept, the poverty line, which is reasonable, as I mentioned, in America, the poverty line is far more different from our Indian poverty line, and we need to really raise that and consider what all we factor it in. My own point that the advantages and the facilities which the government gives, they need to be factored in. And then I think we need to take a multidimensional approach. There's no doubt that is the way going forward. If possible, in the theoretical exercise that you will attempt or someone of us in India can attempt, I think we need to also bring in the concept of value system in understanding income inequality. An attempt needs to be made. Thank you.
That's a great suggestion. Suresh, something, the closing remarks, just keep it to 1 minute.
Yeah, I think the strategy should be to focus on growth. And we find that there is a relationship between growth and poverty reduction, which is documented very clearly in this set of studies. And when I say to really focus on growth, if we look at the major change that has taken place between the last 2 rounds of NFHS, we find that it is education of women that has improved, 1. 2, access to finance has also improved quite a bit. So a growth which is inclusive in terms of educational opportunities as well as access to finance, I think will be the way ahead.
Poonamji, your closing remarks.
So a few things, bullet points. Growth with macroeconomic stability. I think this latter part is very important because we see from around the world that growth which is unsustainable can cause more harm than help. So growth with macroeconomic stability, basic necessities of life, the kind that are being provided, sanitation, drinking water, cooking gas, health and education. Education is very, very important. A level playing field in education is the best equalizer that we can think of.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Leroy, if you'd like to make your final comments.
I have no final comments, but to probe what is happening, apart from better data than PLFS, I think one needs to zero in and figure out what is happening in the specific state. For example, if you are talking about the labor force participation rate, why is it that it is so high in Chhattisgarh? If I begin to understand what is it about Chhattisgarh that has led to, and this is a trend, I'm not talking about an absolute level, has led to, in the midst of all this, to an increase in labor force participation rates from both men and women, then I think we will begin to get some understanding on what drives income growth and consumption growth. Because otherwise it's just data.
Sure. Thank you.